I travel a lot for work. I've been in and out of airports more times than I can count, and I like to think I've seen it all. Delayed flights, stranded passengers, overnight layovers in deserted terminals. But this was different. This was something I still can't explain. It happened last year at a small airport in the Midwest. My flight had been delayed due to a storm, and the few remaining passengers in the terminal slowly disappeared as flights got cancelled or rescheduled. Eventually, it was just me, a handful of airport staff, and an old man sitting several rows away from me. At first, I didn't pay him much attention. He was wearing a long black coat, slightly wrinkled, and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. He sat completely still, staring ahead, as if he were waiting for something. That wasn't weird in itself. People wait at airports all the time. But something about him felt off. After about half an hour, I realized he hadn't moved, not once. No shifting in his seat, no looking at his phone, no checking a watch, just that eerie, unmoving posture. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe he had fallen asleep sitting up. But then, just as I was convincing myself to ignore him, he did something that made my skin crawl. He turned his head toward me, slowly, deliberately, but his body didn't move. It was just his head, twisting unnaturally, his eyes meeting mine from across the terminal. I looked away immediately, pretending I hadn't noticed, but I could feel it, his gaze burning into me. I forced myself to stay calm, checking my phone, pretending to scroll through emails. When I glanced back, his head was still turned toward me, still staring. Then I noticed something even stranger. He was closer. Not by much, but enough for me to be certain he hadn't just shifted in his seat. He had moved, silently, without me seeing it. I swallowed hard, my heart picking up speed. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the lighting, or my own exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then he moved again. This time I saw it. Not a normal movement, no standing, no walking, just a sudden shift, like a flicker in reality. 1 second, he was sitting far away. The next, he was a few rows closer, still facing me, still watching. I grabbed my bag and stood up. I wasn't going to stick around to figure out what was happening. The airport was nearly empty, but I could still see a janitor mopping near the bathrooms. I made my way toward him, trying not to look back, but the hairs on my neck told me the old man was still watching. I reached the janitor and forced a nervous chuckle. "Hey, weird question, but did you see that guy over there move?" The janitor frowned. "What guy?" I turned to point at the old man. He was gone. The terminal was empty. There was no sign he had ever been there. No shifting coats, no fading footsteps. Just rows of silent, empty seats. The janitor must have seen the panic on my face. He gave me a concerned look. "You okay?" I wanted to say yes, to laugh it off, but my voice caught in my throat. I turned back to the janitor, ready to insist I wasn't crazy. And then, a whisper, right behind me. So close, I felt the breath on my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around. Nothing. The janitor took a step back, eyes wide. "Jesus, man, you look like you just saw a ghost." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, grabbed my bag, and bolted to the nearest security checkpoint. I didn't care how long my flight was delayed. I wasn't staying in that terminal any longer than I had to. I never found out who or what that man was. But sometimes, when I'm in an airport late at night, I swear I feel someone watching me. And every so often, in the corner of my eye, I see a figure in a black coat, sitting perfectly still, waiting. I travel a lot for work, so I've spent more nights in airports than I'd like to admit. Delays, layovers, cancellations. I've experienced it all. But what happened to me at Denver International still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It was around 2:30 a.m., and my connecting flight had been delayed until morning. Most of the terminal had shut down, and the few other stranded passengers had found their own corners to sleep in. I wasn't tired though, so I wandered the empty halls, hoping to find an open cafe or at least a vending machine. The silence was unsettling. No announcements, no bustling crowds, just the low hum of fluorescent lights. I felt like I was walking through an abandoned building. That's when I saw him. A man was sitting in one of the rows of chairs near my gate, facing away from me. Nothing about him was particularly strange at first. He was wearing a dark hoodie, jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face. But something was off. He was too still, not sleeping, not using his phone, just sitting, completely motionless. As I passed, I expected to hear the usual rustle of movement or the creak of a shifting seat, but there was nothing. It was like he wasn't even breathing. I kept walking, trying to shake the weird feeling, but after a few steps, I glanced back. He had turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see part of his face under the cap. His mouth was stretched into a grin, a wide, unnatural grin. And his eyes weren't right. They were too dark, too deep, like staring into a void. I looked away and quickened my pace, suddenly aware of how alone I was. I told myself I was just imagining things, that my brain was playing tricks on me because I was tired. I found a vending machine near another gate and bought a bottle of water. As I turned back, I saw the same row of chairs in the distance. The man was gone. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe he had just been another traveler, waiting for a flight, and I had overreacted. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The chair he had been sitting in was still indented, like someone had just been there. I hurried back toward the area near my gate, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. I sat down, put my earbuds in, and focused on my phone. Music always helped drown out my nerves. I must have dozed off because I woke up to a strange noise. A whisper. At first, I thought it was part of my music, but then I realized my earbuds had fallen out. The whisper was real. It was low, just behind me, like someone was speaking inches from my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent ice through my veins. I turned my head slowly. He was there. The man was sitting 2 seats away from me, facing forward, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't been there when I sat down. I was sure of it. His grin was wider now, stretched unnaturally across his face, like his skin was being pulled too tight. His head tilted slightly, and I heard another whisper. It wasn't coming from his mouth. It was coming from inside him. I shot up from my seat, grabbing my bag, heart pounding. I walked as fast as I could without running, refusing to look back. I found a security officer near the closed TSA checkpoint and told him about the man. He gave me a skeptical look, but agreed to check the area. I waited while he radioed another officer and walked back toward the gate. A few minutes later, he returned. "There's no one there," he said. I insisted, describing the man in detail, but he shook his head. I checked the whole section. No one sitting there. You're the only one around that gate. I didn't argue. I just nodded, thanked him, and walked away. I spent the rest of the night in a well-lit area near a security desk, forcing myself to stay awake. When my flight finally boarded at sunrise, I felt a massive sense of relief. I just wanted to get out of that airport. But as I walked down the jet bridge, I caught one last glimpse of the waiting area through the terminal window. The man was there, standing, watching me leave, still grinning. I travel a lot for work, so I've spent more nights in airports than I'd like to admit. Delays, layovers, cancellations, I've seen it all. But one night stands out among the rest, and I still don't know if what I saw was real or if exhaustion finally got to me. It was a little past midnight, and I was stuck at a nearly abandoned airport after my connecting flight got delayed until morning. The airline had already closed their help desk, and the few staff members still around were either cleaning or chatting in hushed voices. The terminal was huge, but completely empty. The kind of empty where even the hum of vending machines seems too loud. Most of the shops had their security gates pulled down, their lights off, except for a small convenience store still open near Gate 47. I figured I'd grab a snack, kill some time before finding a spot to sleep. As I walked toward the store, I noticed something, or someone, at the very end of the terminal. A man. He was sitting in one of those uncomfortable airport chairs, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't reading, just staring. Something about him unsettled me immediately. His posture was unnaturally rigid, like he was forcing himself to sit still. He was wearing an old grey suit, slightly wrinkled, and his shoes looked scuffed and worn down. His face was thin, almost gaunt, and his skin had this sickly, pale hue under the harsh airport lights. I told myself he was just another tired traveler. Maybe his flight got delayed too. But when I passed by, I noticed something even stranger. His eyes weren't just staring, they were locked onto something. Not at the floor, not at a screen, but at a large window facing the dark tarmac. I followed his gaze out to the runway. Nothing. Just a row of parked planes and the reflection of the empty terminal in the glass. Still, he didn't blink, didn't move, just kept staring. I hurried into the store, grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips, and made a point not to look in his direction on the way out. I didn't want to make eye contact. I found a row of seats farther down the terminal and tried to get comfortable. But I couldn't shake this weird feeling, like I wasn't alone, like I was being watched. I glanced back toward where the man had been sitting. He was gone, but his seat wasn't empty. A single, old leather suitcase sat there, right where he'd been. I stared at it for a while, waiting to see if he'd come back for it, but he never did. Curiosity got the best of me. I stood up and walked over to the suitcase, half expecting it to have some kind of name tag. Maybe I could find a staff member and turn it in to Lost and Found. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The suitcase wasn't dusty or scuffed like I thought. It was wet. Dark, damp patches seeped through the edges, and an overwhelming metallic scent filled the air. Blood. I took a step back. My hands felt clammy. My breath hitched in my throat. And then, a tap on the window. I whipped around so fast I nearly tripped. Outside, past the reflection of the empty terminal, past the ghostly glow of the runway lights. Something was standing in the darkness. I couldn't see it clearly, just the outline of a figure, tall and motionless. But what I could see were the hands pressed against the glass, fingers too long, skin too pale, tapping. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned to look toward the airline staff, but the terminal was even emptier than before. When I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. The suitcase too. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. A janitor waking me up at sunrise was the only thing that pulled me out of whatever daze I was in. I asked her if she had seen the man in the suit or the suitcase. She just gave me a puzzled look. "No one's been here all night," she said. I didn't argue. I just grabbed my bag and left. My flight boarded an hour later, but even as the plane took off, I kept thinking about that suitcase, about the blood, about the thing tapping at the glass. I don't sleep in airports anymore